There's a scene no one filmed, but millions of them lived through it. A classroom, the lights off. An 8-year-old crouched under a desk, silent, still, counting the seconds until someone tells them it's over. It wasn't a fire drill, it was a drill for surviving a shooting. And that child had no idea in that moment that they had just received the first lesson of an education nobody had planned for them. They've been called lazy, too sensitive, disconnected from reality, unable to hold a job, unable to hold a conversation without a screen in their hand. But before judging this generation, maybe it's worth asking what they actually lived through to get here. Because Gen Z didn't build any of the world they inherited, not the economic instability that followed 2008, not the climate unraveling a little more every summer, not the social media that reshaped adolescence from the inside, not the pandemic that shut every door at the exact moment they needed to walk through them, not the artificial intelligence already rewriting work before they've even entered it. 5 crises, 1 generation, none of them chosen, and yet they're the ones who will have to live with it. And maybe one day fix it. Picture that same child a few years later, not under a desk this time. At a kitchen table, doing homework while a parent goes through bills for the 3rd time that week, hoping the numbers land differently on the 3rd try. That's the scene psychologists eventually put a name to. They call it a cohort effect. What happens when a whole generation is shaped by the same historic shock at the same time? But what Gen Z lived through doesn't fit the definition they built the word for. This wasn't a shock. It was a permanent state. Not a single event that leaves a mark, the way the Great Depression marked those who lived through it. A continuous, stacked, seemingly endless crisis running through the entire window when a mind is being built. So what does that actually do to a human mind growing up like that? The first answer is almost counterintuitive. An alarm system that never turns off. Growing up with an uninterrupted stream of real threats, mass shootings, a destabilizing climate, a global pandemic, trained this generation into a state of near constant vigilance. We usually call that anxiety, but a neuroscientist would see something else, a perfectly logical adaptation to a world that, objectively, never stopped sending danger signals. It isn't a flaw, it's a system doing exactly what it was built to do. But if danger is everywhere, how do you build anything stable in the middle of it? Go back to that kitchen table for a second. No memory of a stable job market. No memory of housing that didn't eat half a paycheck. No, before the crisis to hold on to, the way older generations could point to a time when things were easier and just wait for it to come back. For Gen Z, instability was never the exception. It was the only economy they ever knew. A well-known economic study found the same pattern in a completely different context. People who live through a major financial shock during their formative years never fully recover from it. Their relationship to risk stays altered for the rest of their lives. So what does it actually change in how you move through life when uncertainty is the only thing you've ever known? Here's where the story stops going where you'd expect. Because that same generation, born into permanent urgency, is also the first to have simultaneous global access to information from early childhood. A political, social, and environmental awareness formed earlier than any generation before them, with no real precedent in human history. They knew what was happening on the other side of the world before they could read a map. It's tempting to file that under one more weight to carry. Except that's not quite what the evidence shows. Then came the chapter with no easy read at all. Lockdown hit at the exact moment their brains needed it least. Adolescence, the period when social interaction shapes who a person becomes. They lost that. Not a small piece of it. One of the most critical windows in human development spent alone behind a screen. That's a real cost. No one should minimize it. So how does a mind compensate for something it never got to experience normally? It doesn't sound like it should have produced anything. Cut off from physical connection at the exact age when connection matters most. And yet, almost without meaning to, this generation built a skill nobody had trained them for: the ability to create trust, collaboration, and community entirely at a distance. In a work world that's dematerializing faster every year, that's not the consolation prize it looks like. One layer is still missing. Gen Z is entering the workforce at the exact moment artificial intelligence is rewriting every rule. Not at the end of a career, like their predecessors who now have to unlearn everything, at the very beginning. For them, AI isn't a disruption, it's a baseline, present since day one, a handicap on paper. Maybe, ask again in 10 years. And here, maybe, is the truth no one has quite put into words yet. Gen Z isn't just the generation that survived the chaos. It's the only generation in modern history whose entire psychological development, the vigilance, the economic resilience, the global awareness, the remote connection, the fluency with artificial intelligence, was, without any of them choosing it, calibrated for exactly the skills the world is going to need over the next 20 years. That's not an unfortunate coincidence. It's, without meaning to be, the most prepared generation in history for a world that's never going back to stable. Think back to that child under the desk, in the dark, counting the seconds. That moment of silent terror wasn't just something to endure. It was, without anyone realizing it yet, the very first training session for a generation learning to stay functional at the center of uncertainty. Gen Z didn't inherit an easier world. They inherited a world that, without ever meaning to, prepared them better than anyone else to fix it. Maybe the real question isn't what this generation lacks. Maybe it's what you'd have become under that same desk in that same dark